Hello, everyone, and welcome to White Fang Wednesday. We'll be reading the book White Fang. I'm going to let people know that I'm streaming, and I'll be right back to read. Let's go ahead and get into the book. Now, I'll tell you right now, I don't know too much about this. Although I believe that White Fang is about a husky or a wolf or both, like Balto. It's about, wolf, husky, and I figured that it'd be in the winter. This is the winter. This is December. Um, so I'm not too sure about this book, but I know that snow, husky, wolves, and possibly sled racing, I don't know, they have to do with winter, they have to do with not necessarily Christmas, but winter. So I figured why not read this book, and we'll go ahead and first off, I'll start off by learning about the author, Jack London. Let's go ahead and go into a narration voice. Jack London was born in San Francisco in 1876 to Flora Wellman and W.H. Chaney. A successful astrologer, Chaney later denied paternity, and Jack took the name of his stepfather, Jack London. Jack adored the sea and had many madcap jobs in his youth, including a spell as an oyster pirate, a fish patrolman, and a deckhand on a voyage to Japan. His passion for books began when he discovered the Oakland Public Library, and he read voraciously and widely. In 1897, impulsive Jack joined the gold rush to the Klondike and returned after a year, penniless, ill, but brimming with stories. In 1900, the first volume of his Alaskan Tales, The Son of the Wolf, was published. The Call of the Wild, 1904, and its companion piece, White Fang, and his most famous works, Jack married Bessie Madden in 1900, and their short marriage produced two daughters. In 1903, he left Bessie for Chairman Kittredge, who accompanied him on a wild 6-year voyage around the Pacific on his boat, the Snark. Jack was generous with his money, expansive and popular, but he became increasingly dissatisfied with his writing ability and grew cynical and pessimistic. He died in 1916 from an overdose of morphine meant to dull the pain of uremia. Whether it was accidental or self-inflicted remains uncertain to this day. Let's start into the book. 100 Classic Books presents White Fang by Jack London. Part 1, Chapter 1, The Trail of the Meat. Dark spruce forest frowned on either side of the frozen waterway. The trees had been stripped by a recent wind of their white covering of frost, and they seemed to lean towards each other, black and ominous. In the fading light, a vast silence reigned over the land. The land itself was a desolation, lifeless, without movement, so lone and cold that the spirit of it was not even that of sadness. There was a hint in it of laughter, but a laughter more terrible than any sadness, a laughter that was mirthless as the smile of the Sphinx, a laughter cold as the frost and partaking of the grimness of infallibility. It was the masterful and incommunicable wisdom of eternity, laughing at the futility of life and the effort of life. It was the wild, the savage, frozen-hearted Northland. Wild, but there was life abroad in the land, and defiant, down the frozen waterway, toiled a string of wolfish dogs. Their bristly fur was rimmed with frost. Their breath froze in the air as it left their mouths, spouting forth in spumes of vapor that settled upon the hair of their bodies and formed into crystals of frost. Leather harness was on the dogs, and leather traces attached them to a sled, which dragged along behind. The sled was without runners. It was made of stout birch bark, and its full surface rested on the snow. The front end of the sled was turned up like a scroll, in order to force down and under the bore of soft snow that surged like a wave before it. On the sled, securely lashed, was a long and narrow oblong box. There were other things in the sled. There were other things in the sled: blankets, an axe, and a coffee pot, and frying pan. But prominent, occupying most of the space, was the long and narrow oblong box. In advance of the dogs on wide snow shores toiled a man. At the rear of the sled toiled a second man. On the sled in the box lay a third man, whose toil was over, a man whom the wild had conquered and beaten down until he would never more struggle, never move, never move nor struggle again. It is not the way of the wild to like movement. Life is an offense to it, for life is movement, and the wild aims always to destroy movement. It freezes the water to prevent it running to the sea, drives the sap out of the trees till they are frozen to their mighty hearts, and most ferociously and terribly of all does the wild harry and crush into submission man who is the most restless of life, ever in revolt against the dictum that all movement must in the end come to the cessation of movement, but at front and rear, unawed and indomitable, toils the two men who were not yet dead. Their bodies were covered with fur and soft tan leather. Eyelashes and cheeks and lips were so coated with the crystals from their frozen breath that their faces were not discernible. They gave them the seeming of ghostly mask, undertakers in a spectral world, at the funeral of some ghost, but under it all they were men. Penetrating the land of desolation and mockery and silence, puny adventurers bent on colossal adventure, pitting themselves against the might of a world as remote and alien and pulseless as the abysses of space. They travelled on without speech, saving their breath for the work of their bodies. On every side was the silence, pressing upon them with a tangible presence. It affected their minds as the many atmospheres of deep water affect the body of the diver. It crushed them with the weight of unending vastness, an unalterable decree. It crushed them into the remotest recesses of their own minds, pressing out of them like juices from the grape all the false ardors and exulsions and undue self-values of the human soul until they perceive themselves finite and small, specks and motes, moving with weak cunning and little wisdom amidst the play and interplay of the great blind elements and forces. An hour went by, and a second hour. The pale light of the short sunless day was beginning to fade, when a faint far cry arose on the still air. It soared upward with a swift rush, till it reached its topmost note, where it persisted, palpitant and tense, and then slowly died away. It might have been a lost soul wailing had it not been infested with a certain sad fierceness and hungry eagerness. The front man turned his head until his eyes met the eyes of the man behind, and then, across the narrow oblong box, each nodded to the other. A second cry arose, piercing the silence with needle-like shrillness. Both men located the sound. It was to the rear, somewhere in the snow expanse they had just traversed. A third and answering cry arose, also to the rear and to the left of the second cry. "They're after us, Bill," said the man at the front. His voice sounded hoarse and unreal, and he had spoken with apparent effort. "Meter's scarce," answered his comrade. "I ain't seen a rabbit sign for days." Thereafter they spoke no more. Through their ears were keen for the hunting cries that continued to rise behind them. At the fall of darkness they swung the dogs into a cluster of spruce trees on the edge of the waterway and made a camp. The coffin at the side of the fire served for seat and table. The wolf dogs, clustered on the far side of the fire, snarled and bickered among themselves, but evinced no inclinations to stray off into the darkness. "Seems to me, Henry, they're staying remarkable close to camp," Bill commented. Henry, squatting over the fire and settling the pot of coffee with a pierce of ice, nodded. Nor did he speak till he had taken his seat on the coffin and begun to eat. "They know where their hides is safe," he said. "They'd sooner eat grub than be rub. They're pretty wise, them dogs." Bill shook his head. "Oh, I know." His comrade looked at him curiously. First time, first time I ever heard you say anything about them. They're not being wise." "Henry," said the other, munching with deliberation the beans he was eating, Did you happen to notice the way them dogs kept up when I was a feeding them?" "They did cut up more than usual," Henry acknowledged. "How many dogs have we got, Henry?" "6. Well, Henry," Bill stopped for a moment in order that his words might gain greater significance. "As I was saying, Henry, we've got 6 dogs. I took 6 fish out of the bag. I gave 1 fish to each dog, and Henry, I was 1 fish short." "You counted wrong. We've got 6 dogs," the other reiterated dispassionately. "I took out 6 fish. One ear didn't get no fish. I came back to the fish afterward and got him his fish." "We've only got 6 dogs," Henry said. "Henry," Bill went on, "I won't say they was all dogs, but there was 7 of 'em that got fish." Henry stopped eating to glance across the fire and count the dogs. "Well, there's only 6 now," he said. "I saw the other one run off across the snow," Bill announced with cool positiveness. "I saw 7." Henry looked at him commiseratingly and said, I'll be almighty glad when this trip's over." "What do you mean by that?" Bill demanded. "I mean that this load of ours is getting on your nerves and that you're beginning to see things." "I thought of that," Bill answered gravely. "And so, when I saw it run off across the snow, I looked in the snow and saw its tracks. Then I counted the dogs, and there was still 6 of them. The tracks is there in the snow now. Do you want to look at 'em? I'll show 'em to you." Henry did not reply, but in munched on in silence until the meat finished. He topped it with a final cup of coffee. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and said, "And you're thinking as it was." A long wailing cry, fiercely sad, from somewhere in the darkness, had interrupted him. He stopped to listen to it. Then he finished his sentence with a wave of his hand towards the sound of the cry. "One of them?" Bill nodded. "I blame I'd a blame sight sooner think that than anything else. You knows yourself the row the dog's made?" Cry after cry and answering cries were turning the silence to a bedlam. From every side the cries arose, and the dogs betrayed their fear of huddling together and so close to the fire that their hair was scorched by the heat. Bill threw on more wood before lighting his pipe. "I'm thinking you're down in the mouth some," Henry said. "Henry?" He sucked meditatively at his pipe for some time before he went on. "Henry, I was a thinking what a blame sight luckier he is than you and me'll ever be." He indicated the third person by a downward thrust of the thumb to the box on which they sat. "You and me, Henry, when we die, we'll be lucky if we get enough stones over our carcasses to keep the dogs off of us." "But we ain't got people and money and all the rest." But we ain't got people and money and all the rest like him," Henry rejoined. "Long distance funeral is something you and me can't exactly afford." "What gets me, Henry, is what a chap this is. That's a lord of something in his own country, and that's never had to bother about grub nor blankets. Why comes a bustin' around the godforsaken ends of the earth? That's what I can't exactly see." "He might have lived to a ripe old age if he'd stayed at home," and Henry agreed. Bill opened his mouth to speak, but changed his mind. Instead, he pointed towards the wall of darkness that pressed about them from every side. There was no suggestion of form in the utter blackness, only could be seen a pair of eyes gleaming like live coals. Henry indicated with his head a second pair, and a third. A circle the gleaming eyes had drawn about their camp. Now and again a pair of eyes moved or disappeared to appear again a moment later. The unrest of the dogs had been increasing, and they stampeded in a surge of sudden fear to the near side of the fire. Cringing and crawling about the legs of the men in the scramble, one of the dogs had been overturned on the edge of the fire, and it had yelped with pain and fright as the smell of its singeing coat possessed the air. The commotion caused the circle of eyes to shift restlessly for a moment, and even to withdraw a bit, but it settled down again as the dogs became quiet. "Henry, it's a blame misfortune to be out of ammunition." Bill had finished his pipe and was helping his companion spread the bed of fur and blanket upon the spruce boughs which he had laid over the snow before supper. Henry grunted and began unlacing his moccasins. "How many carriages did you say you had left?" he asked. "3," came the answer. "And I wished 'twas 300. Then I'd show 'em what for. Damn 'em." I think damn's okay to say on stream. I'm not sure. Uh, language warning. Uh, He shook his first fist angrily at the gleaming eyes and began securely to prop his moccasins before the fire. And I wish this cold snapped brick, he went on. It's been 50 below for 2 weeks now, and I wished I'd never starved on this trip, Henry. I don't know. I don't like the looks of it. I don't feel right. Somehow, and while I wish the trip was over and done with, and you and me are sitting on the fire at Fort McGurry, just about now, and playing cribbage. That's what I wish. Henry grunted and crawled into bed. As he dozed off, he was aroused by his comrade's voice. Say, Henry, that other one that come in and got fish, why didn't the dogs pitch into it? That's what's bothering me. You're bothering too much, Bill, came the sleepy response. You was never like this before. You just shut up now and go to sleep, and you'll be all hunky dory in the morning. Your stomach's sour. That's what's bothering you. The men slept, breathing heavily, side by side, until the one covering the fire died down, and the gleaming eyes drew closer the circle they had flung about the camp. The dogs clustered together in fear, now and again snarling menacingly as a pair of eyes drew close. Once their uproar became so loud that Bill woke up. He got out of bed carefully so as not to disturb the sleep of his comrade, and threw more wood on the fire. As it began to flame up, the circles of eyes drew further back. He glanced casually at the huddling dogs. He rubbed his eyes and looked at them more sharply. Then he crawled back into the blankets. Henry, he said. Oh, Henry! Henry groaned as he passed from sleep to waking and demanded, What's wrong now? Nothing, came the answer. Only there's 7 of them again. I just counted. Henry acknowledged receipt of the information with a grunt, then slid into a snore as he drifted back into sleep. In the morning, it was Henry who awoke first and routed his companion out of bed. Daylight was yet 3 hours away. Though it was already 6 o'clock and in the darkness, Henry went about preparing breakfast, while Bill rolled the blankets and made the sled ready for lashing. Say, Henry, he asked suddenly, how many dogs did you say we had? 6. Wrong, Bill claimed triumphantly. 7 again? Henry queried. No, 5. One's gone. The hell? Henry cried in wrath, leaving the cooking to come and count the dogs. You're right, Bill, he concluded. Fatty's gone. And he went like greased lightning. Once he got started, couldn't have seen him for smoke. No. And he went on like greased lightning. And he went on like greased lightning. Once he got started, couldn't have seen him for smoke. No chance, no chance at all, Henry concluded. They just swallowed him alive. I bet he was yelping as he went down their throats. Damn it. He always was a fool dog, said Bill. But no fool ought to be fool enough to go off and commit. Get himself eaten like that. He looked over the remainder of the team with a speculative eye that summed up instantly the salient traits of each animal. I bet none of the others would have done it. Would do it. Couldn't drive him away with the fire with the club, Phil agreed. Now, I just did think there was something wrong with Fatty anyway. And this was the epitaph of a dead dog on the Northland Trail, less scant than the epitaph of many another dog of many a man. Chapter 2 The She-Wolf. Breakfast eaten and the slim camp outside outfit lashed the sled. The men turned their backs on the cheery fire and launched out into the darkness. At once began to rise the cries that were fiercely sad, cries that called through the darkness and called to one another and answered back. Conversation ceased. Daylight came at 9 o'clock. At midday, the sky to the south warmed to rose color and marked where the bulge of the earth intervened between the meridian sun and the northern world, but the rose color swiftly faded. The gray light of day that remained lasted until 3 o'clock, when it too faded, and the pall of the Arctic night descended upon the lone and silent land. As darkness came on, the hunting cries to right and left and rear drew closer, so close that more than once they sent surges of fear through the toiling dogs, throwing them into short-lived panics. At the conclusion of one such panic, when he and Henry had got the dogs back in the traces, Bill said, "I wish they'd strike game somewhere and go away and leave us alone. They do get on us nerves horrible." Henry sympathized. They spoke no more until camp was made. Henry was bending over and adding ice to the bubbling pot of beans when he was startled by the sound of a blow. An exclamation from Bill, and a sharp snarling cry of pain from among the dogs. He straightened up in time to see a dim form disappearing across the snow to the shelter of the dark. Then he saw Bill standing amid the dogs, half triumphant, half crestfallen, in one hand a stout club, in the other the tail and part of the body of a sun-killed salmon. "You got half of it," he announced. "But I got a whack at it just the same. Did you hear it squeal?" "What'd it look like?" Henry asked. "Couldn't see, but it had 4 legs and a mouth and hair and looked like any dog. Must be a tame wolf, I reckon." "It's damn tame, whatever it is, coming in here at feeding time and getting its whack of fish." That night, when supper was finished and they sat on the oblong box and pulled at their pipes, the circle of gleaming eyes drew in even closer than before. "I wish they'd spring up a bunch of moose or something and go away and leave us alone," Bill said. Henry grunted with an intonation that was not all sympathy, and for a quarter of an hour they sat on in silence, Henry startling at the fire, and Bill at the circle of eyes that burned in the darkness just beyond the firelight. "I wish we was pulling into McGurry right now," he began again. "Shut up with your wishing and your croaking," Henry burst out angrily. "Your stomach's sour, that's what's ailing you. Swallow a spoonful of sody, and you'll sweeten up wonderful, and be more pleasant company." In the morning, Henry was aroused by fervid blasphemy that proceeded from the mouth of Bill. Henry propped himself up on an elbow and looked to see his comrade standing among the dogs beside the replenished fire, his arms raised in objurgation, his face distorted with passion. "Hello," Henry called. "What's up now?" "Frog's gone," came the answer. "No." I tell you, yes. Henry leaped out of the blankets and to the dogs. He counted them with care, and then joined his partner in cursing the power of the wild that had robbed them of another dog. Frog was the strongest dog of the bunch, Bill pronounced finally. And he was no fool dog either. Neither, Henry added. And so was recorded the second epitaph of 2 days. A gloomy breakfast was eaten, and the 4 remaining dogs were harnessed to the sled. The day was a repetition of the days that had gone before. The men toiled without speech across the face of the frozen world. The silence was unbroken, save by the cries of their pursuers, that unseen hung upon their rear. With the coming of night in the mid-afternoon, the cries sounded closer to the pursuers, true and according to their custom, and the dogs grew excited and frightened, and were guilty of panics that tingled their traces and further depressed the 2 men. There, that'll fix you fool critters, Bill said with satisfaction that night, standing erect at completion of his task. Henry left his cooking to come and see. Not only had his partner tied the dogs up, but he had tied them after the Indian fashion, with sticks about the necks of each dog. He had fastened a leather thong to this, and so close to the necks that the dogs could not get his teeth to it. He had tied a stout stick 4 or 5 feet in length. The other end of the stick, in turn, was made fast to a stake in the ground, by means of a leather thong. The dog was unable to gnaw through the leather at his own end of the stick. The stick prevented him from getting at the leather that fastened to the other end. Henry nodded his head approvingly. It's the only contraption that'll ever hold one ear, he said. He can gnaw through leather as clean as a knife and just about half as quick. They all be here in the morning hunky-dory. You just bet they will, Bill affirmed. If one of 'em turns up missing, I'll go without my coffee. They just know we ain't loaded to kill, Henry remarked at bedtime, indicating the gleaming circle that hemmed down in them in. If we could put a couple of shots into 'em, they'd be more respectful. They come closer every night. Get the firelight out of your eyes and look hard there. Did you see that one? For some time the 2 men amused themselves with watching the movement of vague forms on the edge of the firelight, by looking closely and steadily at where a pair of eyes burned in the darkness. The form of the animal would slowly take shape. They could even see their forms at times. A sound among the dogs attracted the men's attention. One ear was uttering quick, eager whines, lunging at the lengths of his stick towards the darkness, and desisting now and again in order to make frantic attacks on the stick with his teeth. Look at that, Bill, Henry whispered, full into the firelight with a stealthy sidelong movement, glided at a dog-like animal. It moved with comingly mistrust and daring, cautiously observing the men, its attention fixed on the dogs. One ear strained the full length of the stick towards the intruder and whined with eagerness. That full one ear don't seem scared much, Bill said in a low tone. It's a she-wolf, Henry. It's a she-wolf, Henry whispered back. And that counts for Fatty and Frog. She's a decoy for the pack. She draws out the dog, and then all the rest pitches in and eats him up. The fire crackled, a log fell apart with a loud sputtering noise. At the sound of it, the strange animal leaped back into the darkness. Henry, I'm a-thinking, Bill announced. Thinking what? I'm a-thinking that was the one I lambasted with a club. It's the slightest doubt in the world, was Henry's response. And right there, I want to remark, Bill went on, that animal's familiarity with campfires is suspicious and immoral. It knows for certain more than a self-respecting wolf ought to know, Henry agreed. A wolf that knows enough to come in with a dog at feeding time has yet experienced. Old villain had a dog once that ran away with the wolves, Phil cogitated aloud. I had to know. I shouted out of the pack in a moose pasture over in Little Stick. An old villain cried like a baby. Hadn't seen it for 3 years, he said. Been with the wolves all that time. I reckon you call that turn, Bill. That wolf's got a dog in its teeth eating fish many's the time from the hand of man. And if it gets a chance at it, that wolf that's a dog'll be just meat, Bill declared. We can't afford to lose no more animals. But you've only got but you've only got three cartridges, Henry said, objected. I'll wait for a sure shot, was the reply. In the morning, Henry renewed the fire and cooked breakfast to the accompaniment of his partner's snoring. You was just too comfortable for anything, Henry told him as he routed him out for breakfast. I hadn't the heart to rouse you. Bill began to eat sleepily. He noticed that his cup was empty, and started to reach for the pot. But the pot was beyond an arm's length, and beside Henry. Say, Henry, he chided against. Say, Henry, he chided gently. Ain't you forgot something? Henry looked about with great carefulness, and shook his head. Bill held up the empty cup. You don't get no coffee. You don't get no coffee, Henry announced. Ain't run out? Bill asked anxiously. Nope. I ain't thinking it'll hurt my digestion. Nope. A flush of angry blood pervaded Bill's face. That's just warm and anxious I am to be hearing you explain yourself, he said. Banker's gone, Henry announced. Without haste, with the air of one resignation of misfortune, Bill turned his head, and from where he sat counted the dogs. How'd it happen? He asked apathetically. Henry shrugged his shoulders. Don't know, unless one of your gnawed him loose. He couldn't have done it himself, that's for sure. The darn cuss. Bill spoke bravely and slowly, with no hint of the anger that was raging within. Just because he couldn't chew himself loose. He chews Spanker loose? Well, Spanker's trouble is over anyway. I guess he's digested by this time, and converting with the landscape and the bellies of 20 different wolves, was Henry's epitaph on this. The latest lost dog. Have you some coffee, Bill? But Bill shook his head. Go on, Henry. Go on, Henry pleaded, elevating the pot. Bill shoved his cup aside. I'll be ding-dong dinged if I do. I said I wouldn't if any dog turned up missing, and I won't. It's darn good coffee, Henry said enticingly. But Bill was stubborn, and he ate a dry breakfast washed down with mumbled curses at one ear for the trick he had played. I'll tie him, I'll tie him up out of reach of each other tonight, Bill said, as they took the trail. They had traveled little more than 100 yards when Henry, who was in front, bent down and picked up something with which his snowshoe had glided. It was dark, and he could not see it, but he recognized it by the touch. He flung it back so that it struck the sled and bounced along until it freshed up on Bill's snowshoes. Maybe you'll need that in your business, Henry said. Bill uttered an exclamation. It was all that was left of Spanker, the stick with which he had been tied. They ate him, hide and all. They ate him, hide and all, Bill announced. The stick's as clean as a whistle. They've ate the leather off on both sides. They're damn hungry. They ate hide and all. The stick's as clean as a whistle. They've ate the leather off on both ends. They're damn hungry. Henry, and they'll have you and me guessing before this trip's over. Henry laughed defiantly. I've been trailed this way by wolves before, but I've gone through a lot worse and kept my health. It takes more than a handful of them pesky critters to do for years truly, Bill. My son. I don't know, Bill muttered ominously. Well, you'll know all right when we pull into McGurty. I ain't feeling special enthusiastic, Bill persisted. You're off color. That's what's the matter with you, Henry dogmatized. What you need is quinine, and I'm sure to dose you up stiff as soon as we make McGurry. Hold on a moment, I'm gonna search up what that means. An anti-parasite. Okay, so it's a drug that cures parasites. Bill grunted his disagreement with the diagnosis and lapsed into silence. The day was like all the days. Light came at 9 o'clock. At 12 o'clock, the southern horizon was warmed by the unseen sun, and then began the cold gray of afternoon that would merge 3 hours later into night. It was just after the sun's futile effort to appear that Bill slipped the rifle from under the sled, lashing, and said, You keep right on, Henry. I'm going to see what I can see. You'd better stick by the sled, his partner protested. You've only got 3 cartridges, and there's no telling what might happen. Who's croaking now? Bill demanded triumphantly. Henry made no reply, and plodded on alone, though often he cast anxious glances back into the grey solitude where his partner had disappeared. An hour later, taking advantage of the cut-offs around which the sled had to go, Bill arrived. They're scattering ranging along wide, he said. Keeping up with us and looking for game at the same time. You see, they're sure of us, only they know they've got to wait to get us. In the meantime, they're willing to pick up anything edible that comes handy. You mean they think they're sure of us? Henry objected pointedly. but Bill ignored him. I seen some of them. They're pretty thin. They're they ain't had a bite in weeks, I reckon, outside of Fatty and Frog and Spanker, and there's so many of 'em that didn't go far. They're remarkably thin. Their ribs is like washboards, and their stomachs is like right up against their backbones. They're pretty desperate, I can tell you. They'll be going mad yet, and then watch out. A few minutes later, Henry, who was now traveling behind the sled, emitted a low warning whistle. Bill turned and looked, then quietly stopped the dogs to the rear. From around the west bend and plainly into view, on the very trail they had just covered, trotted a furry, slinking form. Its nose was to the trail, and it trotted with a peculiar, sliding, effortless gait. When they halted, it halted, throwing up its head and regarding them steadily with nostrils that twitched as it caught and studied the scent of them. It's the she-wolf, Bill answered. The dogs had lain down in the snow, and he walked past them to join his partner in the sled. Together they watched the strange animal that had pursued them for days and that had already accomplished the destruction of half their dog team. After searching scrutiny, the animal trotted forward a few steps. This was repeated several times till it was a short 100 yards away. It paused, head up close by a clump of spruce trees, and with sight and scent studied the outfit of the watching men. It looked at them in a strangely wistful way, after the manner of a dog, but in its wistfulness there was none of the dog's affection. It was a wistfulness bred of hunger, as cruel as its own fangs, as merciless as the frost itself. It was large for a wolf, its squat frame advertising the lines of an animal that was among the largest of its kind. Stands pretty close to 2.5 feet at the shoulders, Henry commented. And I'll bet it ain't far from 5 feet long. Kind of a strange color for a wolf, was Bill's criticism. I never seen a red wolf before. Looks almost cinnamon to me. The animal was certainly not cinnamon colored. Its coat was the true wolf coat. The dominant color was gray, and yet there was to it a faint reddish hue, a hue that was baffling, that appeared and disappeared, that was more like an illusion of the vision, now gray, distinctively gray, and again giving hints and glints of a vague redness of color, not classifiable in terms of extraordinary experience. Looks for all the world like a big, husky sled dog, Bill said. I wouldn't be surprised to see it. Wag its tail. Hello, you husky, he called. Come here, whatever your name is. Ain't a bit scared of you, Henry laughed. Bill waved his hand at it threateningly and shouted loudly, but the animal betrayed no fear. The only change in it that they could notice was an accession of alertness. It still regarded them with the merciless wistfulness of hunger. They were meat, and it was hungry, and it would like to go in and eat them if it dared. Look here, Henry, Bill said, unconsciously lowering his voice to a whisper because of what he meditated. We've got 3 cartridges, but it's a dead shot. Couldn't miss it. It's got away with 3 of our dogs, and we oughter put a stop to it. What do you say? Henry nodded his consent. Bill cautiously slipped the gun from under the sled lashing. The gun was on the way to his shoulder. but it never got there, for in that instant the she-wolf leaped sideways from the trail into the clump of spruce trees and disappeared. The two men looked at each other. Henry whistled long and comprehendingly. I might have known it, Bill chided himself aloud as he replaced the gun. Of course, a wolf that knows enough to come in with a dogs at feeding time and know all shooting irons. I tell you right now, Henry, that critter's the cause of all our trouble. We'd have 6 dogs at the present time, instead of 3 if it wasn't for her. And I tell you right now, Henry, I'm going to get her. She's too smart to be shot in the open, but I'm going to lay for her. I'll bushwhack her as sure as my name is B. You needn't stray off too far in doing it, his partner admonished. If that pack ever starts to jump you, them 3 cartridges be worth no more than 3 whoops in hell. Them animals is damn hungry, and once they start in, they'll sure get you, Bill. They camped early that night. 3 dogs could not drag the sled so fast nor for so long hours as could 6, and they were showing unmistakable signs of playing out, and the men went early to bed. Bill first saying to it that the dogs were tied out of not in reach of one another, but the wolves were growing bolder, and the men were aroused more than once from their sleep. So near did the wolves approach that the dogs became frantic with terror, and it was necessary to replenish the fire from time to time in order to keep the marauders at safer distance. I've heard sailors talk of sharks following a. I've heard of sharks. I've heard sailors talk of sharks following a ship, Bill remarked as he crawled back into the blankets after one such replenishing of the fire. Well, them wolves is land sharks. They know their business better than we do, and they ain't a holding our trail this way for their health. They're going to get us. They're sure going to get us, Henry. They've half got you already, a talking like that, Henry retorted sharply. A, ma- a man's half licked when he says he is, and you're half eaten from the way you're going on about it. They've got away with better than me than you and me. They've gotten better away with better men than you and me, Bill whispered. Bill answered. Oh, shut up, you're croaking. You make me all fired up. I'm tired. Henry rolled over and angrily on his side, but then surprised that Bill made no similar display of temper. This was not Bill's way, for he was easily angered by sharp words. Henry thought long over it before he went to sleep, and at his eyelids fluttered down and he dozed off. The thought in his mind was, there's no mistaking it. Bill's almighty blue. I'll have to cheer him up tomorrow. I'm gonna get some water, uh, help my throat a little bit. All right, Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Hunger Cry. The day began auspiciously. They had lost no dogs during the night, and they swung out upon the trail and into the silence, the darkness, and the cold with spirits that were fairly light. Bill seemed to have forgotten his forebodings of the previous night, and even waxed vicious with the dogs when at midday they overturned the sled on a bad piece of trail. It was an awkward mix-up. The sled was upside down and jammed between a tree trunk and a huge rock, and they were forced to unharness the dogs in order to straighten out the tangle. The two men were bent over the sled and trying to right it, when Henry observed One Ear sidling away. Here you, here you, One Ear, he cried, straightening up and turning around on the dog. But One Ear broke into a run across the snow, his traces trailing behind him, and there, out in the snow of their backtrack, was the she-wolf waiting for him. As he neared her, he became suddenly cautious. He slowed down for an alert and minced walk, and then stopped. He regarded her carefully and dubiously, yet decisively. She seemed to smile at him, showing her teeth in an ingratiatingly, gratingly, rather than a menacing way. She moved toward him a few steps, playfully, and then halted. One Ear drew near to her, still alert and cautious, his tail and ears in the air, his head held high. He tried to sniff noses with her, but she retreated playfully and coyly. Every advance on his part was accompanied by a corresponding retreat on her part. Step by step, she was luring him away from the security of his human companionship. Once, as though a warning had in vague ways flitted through his intelligence, he turned his head and looked back at the overturned sled, at his teammates, and at the two men who were calling to him. But whatever idea was forming in his mind was dissipated by the she-wolf, who advanced upon him, sniffled nose with him for a fleeting instant, and then resumed her coy retreat before his renewed advances. In the meantime, Bill had bethought himself of the rifle, but it was jammed beneath the overturned sled, and by the time Henry had helped him to right the load, One Ear and the she-wolf were too close together, and the distance too great to risk a shot. Too late, One Ear learned his mistake. Before they saw the cause, the two men saw him turn and start to run back towards them. Then, approaching at the right angles to the trail and cutting off his retreat, they saw a dozen wolves, lean and gray, bouncing across the snow on the instant. The she-wolf's coyness and playfulness disappeared. With a snarl, she sprang upon One Ear. He thrust her off with his shoulder, and his retreat cut off, and still intent on regaining the sled, he altered his course in an attempt to circle around to it. More wolves were appearing every moment, and joining in the chase. The she-wolf was one leap behind One Ear and holding her own. "Where are you going?" Henry suddenly demanded, laying his hand on his partner's arm. Bill shook it off. "I won't stand it," he said. "They ain't a-going to get any more of our dogs if I can help it." Gun in hand, he plunged into the underbrush that lined the side of the trail. His intention was apparent enough, taking the sled as the center of the circle that One Ear was making. Bill planned to tap that circle at a point in advance of the pursuit. With his rifle in the broad daylight, it may be possible for him to awe the wolves and save the dog. "Say, Bill," Henry called after him. "Be careful. Don't take no chances." Henry sat down on the sled and watched. There was nothing else for him to do. Bill had already gone from sight, but now and again, appearing and disappearing amongst the underbrush and the scattered clumps of spruce, could be seen one ear. Henry judged his case to be hopeless. The dog was thoroughly alive to its danger, but it was running on the outer circle while the wolf pack was running on the inner and shorter circle. It was vain to think of one ear so outdistancing his pursuers as to be able to cut across the circle and advance up them, and to regain the sled. The different lines were rapid, approaching a point. Somewhere out there in the snow, screeched from his sight by trees and thickets, Henry knew that the wolf pack, One Ear, and Bill were coming together. All too quickly, far more quickly than he had expected, it happened. He heard a shot, then two shots in rapid succession, and he knew that Bill's ammunition was gone. Then he heard a great outcry of snarls and yelps. He recognized One Ear's yell of pain and terror, and he heard a wolf cry that bespoke a stricken animal, and that was all. The snarls ceased, the yelping died away. Silence settled down again over the lonely land. He sat for a long while upon the sled. There was no need for him to go and see what had happened. He knew it as though it had taken place before his eyes. Once he roused with a start and hastily got the axe out from underneath the lashing, but for some time longer he sat and rooted, the two remaining dogs crouching and trembling at his feet. At last he arose in a weary manner, as though all the resilience had gone out of his body, and proceeded to fasten the dogs to the sled. He passed a rope over his shoulder, a man's face, and pulled with the dogs. He did not go far. At the first hint of darkness, he hastened to make a camp, and he saw to it that he had a generous supply of firewood. He fed the dogs, cooked and ate his supper, and made his bed close to the fire. But he was not destined. But he was not destined to enjoy that bed. Before his eyes closed, the wolves had drawn too near for safety, and no longer required an effort of the vision to see them. They were all about him and the fire in a narrow circle, and he could see them plainly in the firelight, lying down, sitting up, crawling forward on their bellies or slinking back and forth. They even slept. Here and there he could see one curled up in the snow like a dog, taking the sleep that was now denied himself. He kept the fire brightly blazing, for he knew that it alone inter- intervened between the flesh of his body and their hungry fangs. His two dogs stayed close by him, one on either side, leaning against him for protection, crying and whimpering at times, snarling desperately when a wolf approached a little closer than usual. At such moments, when his dogs snarled, the whole circle would be agitated, the wolves coming to their feet and pressing tentatively forward, a chorus of snarls and eager yelps rising about them. Then the circle would lie down again, and here and there a wolf would resume its broken nap. But this circle had a continuous tendency to draw in upon him, bit by bit, an inch at a time, with here a wolf bellying forward, and there a wolf bellying forward. The circle would narrow until the brutes were almost within springing distance. Then he would seize brands from the fire and hurl them into the pack. A hasty drawing back always resulted, accompanied by angry yelps and frightened snarls when a well-aimed brand struck and scorched a too daring animal. Morning found the man haggard and wide-eyed from want of sleep. He cooked breakfast in the darkness, and at 9 o'clock, when, with the coming of daylight, The wolf pack drew back. He set about the task he had planned through the long hours of the night. Chopping down young saplings, he made them cross bars of a scaffold by lashing them high up to the trunks of standing trees, using the sled lashing for a paving rope. And with the aid of the dogs, he hoisted the coffin to the top of the scaffold. They got Bill, and they may get me, but they'll sure never get you, young man, he said, addressing the dead body in its tree sepulchre. Then he took the trail the lightened sled bounding along behind the wheeling dogs, for they too knew that safety lay open in the gaining of Fort McGurdy. The wolves were now more open in their pursuit, trotting sedately behind and ranging along on either side, their red tongues lolling out, their lean sides showing the vaulting ribs with every movement. They were very lean, mere skin backs, stretched over bony frames with strings for muscles. So lean that Henry found it in his mind to marvel that they still kept their feet and did not collapse forthright in the snow. He did not dare travel until dark. At midday, not only did the sun warm the southern horizon, but it even thrust its upper rim pale and golden above the skyline. He received it as a sign. The days were growing longer, sun was returning, but scarcely had the cheer of its light departed when he went into camp. There were still several hours of grey daylight and sombre twilight, and he utilized them in chopping an enormous supply of firewood. With night came horror. Not only were the starving wolves growing bolder, but lack of sleep was telling upon Henry. He dozed despite himself, crouching by the fire, the blankets about his shoulders, the axe between his knees, and on either side a dog pressing close against him. He awoke once and saw in front of him, not a dozen feet away, a big grey wolf, one of the largest of the pack. And even as he looked, the brute deliberately stretched himself after the manner of a lazy dog, yawning full in his face, and looking upon him with a possessive eye, as if in truth he were merely a delayed meal that was soon to be eaten. This certified was shown by the whole pack, fully a score he could count, staring hungrily at him or calmly sleeping in the snow. They reminded him of children, gathered about a spread table and awaiting permission to begin to eat. And he was the food they were going to eat. He wondered how and when the meal would begin. As he piled wood on the fire, he discovered an appreciation of his own body which he had never felt before. He watched his moving muscles and was interested in the cunning mechanisms of his fingers. By the light of the fire, he crooked his fingers slowly and repeatedly, now one at a time, now all together, spreading them wider, making quick, gripping movements. He studied the nail formation and produced the fingertips now sharply and again softly, gauging the while the nerve sensations produced. It fascinated him, and he grew suddenly fond of this subtle flesh of his that worked so beautifully, smoothly, and delicately. Then he would cast a glance of fear at the wolf circle drawn expectantly about him, and like a blow the realization would strike him that this wonderful body of his, this living flesh, was no more than so much meat, a quest of ravenous animals to be torn and slashed by their hungry fangs, to be sustenance to them as the moose and the rabbit had often been sustenance to him. He came out of a doze that was half nightmare to see the red-hued she-wolf before him. She was not more than half a dozen feet away, sitting in the snow and wistfully regarding him. The two dogs were whimpering and snarling at his feet, but she took no notice of them. She was looking at the man, and for some time he returned her look. There was nothing threatening about her. She looked at him merely with a great wistfulness, but he knew it to be the wistfulness of an equally great hunger. He was the food, and the sight of him excited in her the gustatory sensations. Her mouth opened and saliva rolled forth, and she licked her chops with the pleasure of anticipation. A spasm of fear went through him. He reached hastily for a brand to throw at her, but even as he reached, and before his fingers had closed in on the missile, she sprang back into safety, and he knew that she was used to having things thrown at her. She had snarled as she sprang away, baring her white fangs to their roots, as all her wistfulness vanishing, being replaced by a cavernous malignity that made him shudder. He glanced at the hand that held the brand, noticing the cunning delicacy of the fingers that gripped it, how they adjusted themselves to all the inequalities of surface, curling over and under about the rough wood, and one little finger too close to the burning portion of the brand, sensitively and automatically writhing back from the hurtful heat to a cooler gripping place, and in the same instant he seemed to see a vision, those same sensitive and delicate fingers being crushed and torn by the... One moment. Testing. Okay. Being crushed and torn by the white teeth of the she-wolf. Never had he been so fond of this body of his as now when his tenure of it was so precarious. All night with burning brands he fought off the hungry pack. When he dozed despite himself, the whimpering and snarling of the dogs aroused him. Morning came, but for the first time the light of day failed to scatter the wolves. The man waited in vain for them to go. They remained in a circle about him, and his fire displaying an arrogance of possession that shook his courage to his courage born of the morning light. He made one desperate attempt to pull out on the trail. The moment he left the protection of the fire, the boldest wolf leaped for him, but leaped short. He saved himself by springing back, the jaws snapping together a scant 6 inches from his thigh. The rest of the pack was now up and surging upon him, and a throwing of firebrands right and left was necessary to drive them back to a respectful distance. Even in the daylight, he did not dare to leave the fire to chop fresh wood. 20 feet away towered a huge dead spruce. He spent half the day extending his campfire to the tree. At any moment, a half-dozen burning, ready at hand to fling at his enemies. Once at the tree, he studied the surrounding forest in order to fell the tree in the direction of the most firewood. The night was a repetition of the night before, save that the need for sleeping had become overpowering. The snarling of his dogs was losing its efficiency. Besides, they were snarling all the time, and his benumbed and drowsy senses no longer took note of changing pitch and intensity. He awoke with a start. The she-wolf was less than a yard from him, mechanically at short range. Without letting go of it, he thrust a brand full into her mouth and snarling into her open and snarling mouth. She sprang away, yelling with pain, and while he took delight in the smell of burning flesh and hair, he watched her shaking her head and growling wrathfully, a score of feet away. But this time, before he dozed again, He tied a burning pine knot to his right hand. His eyes were closed a few minutes when the burn of the flame on his flesh awakened him. For several hours he adhered to this program. Every time he was thus awakened he drove back the wolves with flying rats, replenished from the fire, and rearranged the pine knot on his hand. All worked well, but there came a time when he fastened the pine knot insecurely. As his eyes closed and fell away from his hand, he dreamed it seemed to him that he was in Fort McCurdy. It was warm and comfortable, and he was playing cribbage with the factor. Also, it seemed to him that the fort was besieged by wolves. They were howling at the very gates, and sometimes he and the factor paused from the game to listen and laugh at the futile effort of the wolves to get in. And then, so strange was the dream, there was a crash, the door was burst open. He could see the wolves flooding into the big living room of the fort. They were leaping straight for him, and the factor with the bursting open of the door. The noise of their howling had increased tremendously. This howling now bothered him. His dream was merging into something else. He knew not what, but through it all, following him, persisted the howling, and then he awoke to find the howling real. There was a great snarling and yelping. The wolves were rushing him. They were all about him, and upon him. The teeth of one had closed upon his arm. Instinctively he leaped into the fire, and as soon as he leaped, he felt the sharp slash of teeth that tore through the flesh of his leg. Then began a firefight. His stout mittens temporarily protected his hands, and he scooped live coals into the air in all directions until the campfire took on the semblance of a volcano. But it could not last long. His face was blistering in the heat. His eyebrows, and lashes were singed off, and the heat was becoming unbearable to his feet. A flaming brand in each hand, he sprang to the edge of the fire. The wolves had been driven back on every side. Wherever the live coals had fallen, the snow was sizzling, and every little while a retiring wolf, with wild leap and snort and slash, announced that such live coal had been stepped upon. Flinging his brands at the nearest of his enemies, the man thrust his smouldering mittens into the snow and stamped, about to cool his feet. His 2 dogs were missing, and he well knew that they were served as a course in the protracted meal which had begun days before with Patty, the last course of which would likely be himself in the days to follow. "You ain't got me yet," he cried savagely, shaking his fist at the hungry beast, and at the sound of his voice the whole circle was agitated. There was a general snarl, and the she-wolf slid up close to him across the snow and watched him with hungry wistfulness. He sat to work to carry out a new idea that had come to him. He extended the fire into a large circle. Inside the circle he crouched his sleeping outfit under him, as a protection against the melting snow where he had thus disappeared, within his shelter of flame. The whole pack came curiously to the realm of the fire to see what had become of him. Hitherto they had been denied access to the fire, and they now settled down in a close-drawn circle like so many dogs, blinking and yawning and stretching their lean bodies to the unaccustomed warmth. Then the she-wolf sat down, pointed her nose at a star, and began to howl. One by one, the wolves joined her, till the whole pack on haunches, with nose pointed skyward, was howling its hunger cry. Dawn came in daylight. The fire was burning low. The fuel had run out, and there was need to get more. The man attempted to step out of his circle of flame, but the wolves surged to meet him. Burning brands made them spring aside, but they no longer sprang back. In vain he strove to drive them back. As he gave up and stumbled aside his circle, a wolf leaped for him, missed, and landed with all 4 feet in the coals. It cried out with terror, at the same time snarling, and scrambled back to cool its paws in the snow. The man sat down on his blankets in a crouching position. His body leaned forward from the hips, his shoulders relaxed and drooping, and his head on his knees advertised that he had given up the struggle. Now and again he raised his head to note the dying down of the fire. The circle of flame and coals was breaking into segments, with openings in between. These openings grew in size, the segments diminished. I guess you can come and get me any time, he mumbled. Anyway, I'm going to sleep. Once he wakened, and in an opening in the circle directly in front of him, he saw the she-wolf gazing at him. Again he wakened, a little later, though it seemed hours to him. A mysterious change had taken place, so mysterious a change that he was shocked, wide awake. Something had happened. He could not understand at first. Then he discovered it. The wolves were gone. Remained only the trampled snow to show how closely they had pressed him. Sleep was welling up and gripping him again. His head was sinking down upon his knees when he roused with a sudden start. There were cries of men, the churn of sleds, the creaking of harnesses, and the eager whimpering of straining dogs. 4 sleds pulled in from the river beds to camp among the trees. 6 men were about the man who crouched in the center of the dying fire. They were shaking and prodding him into consciousness. He looked at them like a drunken man and maundered in strange, sleepy speech. Red, a she-wolf, come in with the dogs at feeding time. First she ate the dog food, then she ate the dogs, and after that she ate Bill. Where's Lord Alfred? One of the men bellowed in his ear, shaking him roughly. He shook his head slowly. No, she didn't eat him. He's resting in a tree at the last camp. Dead? The man shouted. In a box, Henry answered. He jerked his shoulder particularly away from the grip of his questioner. Say, you let me alone. I'm just plump tuckered out. Good night, everybody. His eyes fluttered and went shut. His chin fell forward on his chest, and even as they eased him down upon the blankets, his snores were rising on the frosty air. But there was another sound. Far and faint it was, in the remote distance, the cry of the hungry wolf pack, as it took the trail of other meat than the man it had just missed. Part 2, Chapter 1, The Battle of the Fangs. It was the she-wolf who had first caught the sound of men's voices and the whining of the sled dogs, and it was the she-wolf who was first to spring away from the cornered man in his circle of dying flame. The park had been loath to forego the kill it had hunted down, and it lingered for several minutes, making sure of the sounds, and then it, too, sprang away on the trail made by the she-wolf. Running at the forefront of the pack was a large gray wolf, one of its several leaders. It was he who directed the pack's course on the heels of the she. It was he who snarled warningly at the younger members of the pack, or slashed at them with his fangs when they ambitiously tried to pass him. and it was he who increased the pace when he sighted the sheep. Now trotting slowly across the snow, she dropped in alongside by him, as though it were her appointed position, and took the pace of the pack. He did not snarl at her, nor show his teeth, when any leap of hers chanced to put her in advance of him. On the contrary, he seemed kindly disposed toward her, too kindly to suit her, for he was prone to run near to her, and when he ran too near, it was she who snarled and showed her teeth. Nor was she above slashing his shoulder sharply on occasion. At such times he betrayed no anger. He merely sprang to the side and ran stiffly ahead for several awkward leaps, in carriage and in conduct resembling an abashed country swain. This was his one trouble in the running of the pack. But she had other troubles. On her other side ran a gaunt old wolf, grizzled and marked with the scars of many battles. He ran always on her right side. The fact that he had but one eye, and that the left eye might account for this. He also was addicted to crowding her, to veering towards her till his scarred muzzle touched her body, or shoulder, or neck. As with the running mate on the left, she repelled these attentions with her teeth. But when both bestowed their attentions at the same time, she was roughly jostled, being compelled with quick snaps to either side to drive both levers away, and at the same time to maintain her forward leap with the pack, and see the way of her feet before her. At such times the running mates flashed their teeth and growled threateningly across at each other. They might have fought, but even wooing and its rivalry waited upon the more pressing hunger need of the pack. Also, each repulse when the old wolf sheared abruptly away from the sharp-toothed object of his desire. He shouldered against a young 3-year-old that ran on his blind right side. This young wolf had attained his full size and considered the weak and famished condition of the pack. He possessed more than the average vigor and spirit. Nevertheless, he ran with his head, even with the shoulder of his one-eyed elder. When he ventured to run abreast of the elder wolf, which was seldom a snarl and a snap sent him back even with the shoulder again. Sometimes, however, he dropped cautiously and slowly behind and edged in between the old leader and the she-wolf. This was doubly resented, even triply resented, when she snarled her displeasure with the old leader would whirl on the 3-year-old. Sometimes she whirled with him, sometimes the young leader on the left whirled too. At such times, confronted by 3 sets of savage teeth, the young wolf stopping precipitately, throwing himself back on his haunches, with forelegs stiff, mouth menacing, and mane bristling, this confusing and the front of the moving pack always caused confusion in the rear. The wolf behind collided with the younger wolf and expressed their displeasure by administering sharp nips on his hind legs and flanks. He was laying up trouble for himself, for lack of food and short tempers went together. But with the boundless faith of youth, he persisted in repeating the maneuver every little while. Though it never succeeded in gaining anything for him but discomfort, for sure, had there been food, love-making and fighting would have gone on apace, and the pack formation would have been broken up, but the situation of the pack was desperate. It was lean, with long-standing hunger. It ran below its ordinary speed at the rear, limped the weak members, the very young and the very old, at the front were the strongest. Yet all were more like skeletons than full-bodied wolves. Nevertheless, with the exception of the one that limped, the movements of the animals were effortless and tireless. The stringy muscles seemed founts of inexhaustible energy. Behind every steel-like contraction of a muscle lay another steel-like contraction, and another, apparent without end. They ran many miles that day. They ran through the night, and the next day found them still running. They were running over the surface of a world frozen and dead. No life frozen, no life stirred. They were alone moved through the vast inertness. They alone were alive, and they sought for other things that were alive in order that they might devour them, continue to live. They crossed low divides and ranged a dozen small streams in a lower lying country before their quest was rewarded. Then they came upon moose. It was a big bull that they first found. Here was meat and life, and it was guarded by no mysterious fires nor flying missiles of flame. Splay hoofs and palmetted antlers they knew. They flung their customary patience and caution to the wind. It was a brief fight and fierce. The big bull was beset on every side. He ripped them open or split their skulls with shrewdly driven blows of his great hoofs. He crushed them and broke them on his large horns. He stampled them he stamped them into the snow under him in the wallowing struggle, but he was foredoomed, and he went down with the she-wolf tearing savagely at his throat, and with every teeth fixed everywhere upon him, devouring him alive before ever his last struggles ceased or his last damage had been wrought. There was food in plenty. The bull weighed over 800 pounds, fully 20 pounds of meat per mouth for the 40-odd wolves of the pack. But if they could fast prodigiously, they could feed prodigiously, and soon a few scattered bones were all that remained of the splendid live brute that had faced the pack a few hours before. There was now much resting and sleeping, with full stomachs. Bickering and quarreling began among the younger males, and this continued through the few days that followed before the breaking up of the pack. The famine was over. The wolves were now in the country of game, and though they still hunted in pack, they hunted more cautiously, cutting up heavy cows or crippled old bulls from the small moose herds they ran across. There came a day in this land of plenty when the wolf pack split in half and went in different directions. The she-wolf, the younger leader on her left, and the one-eyed elder on her right, led their half of the pack down to the Mackenzie River and across into the lake country in the east. Each day this remnant of the pack dwindled, 2 by 2, male and female. The wolves were deserting. Occasionally a solitary male was driven out by the sharp teeth of his rivals. In the end, there remained only 4, the she-wolf, the young leader, the one-eyed one, and the ambitious 3-year-old. The she-wolf had by now developed a ferocious temper. Her 3 suitors all bore the marks of her teeth, yet they never replied in kind, never defended themselves against her. They turned their shoulders to her most savage slashes. and with wagging tails and mincing steps strove to placate her wrath. But if they were all wildness towards her, they were all fierceness towards one another. The 3-year-old grew too ambitious in his fierceness. He caught the one-eyed Helder on his blind side and ripped his ear into ribbons. Though the grizzled old fellow could see only could see only old fellow could see only on one side against the youth and vigor of the other, he brought into play the wisdom of long years of experience. His lost eye and scared, his scarred muzzle bore evidence to the nature of his experience. He had survived too many battles to be in doubt for a moment about what to do. The battle began fairly, but it did not end fairly. There was no telling what the outcome would have been. For the third wolf joined the elder, and together old leader and young leader, they attacked the ambitious 3-year-old and proceeded to destroy him. He was beset on either side by the merciless fangs of his erstwhile comrades. Forgotten were the days they had hunted together, the game they had pulled down, the famine they had suffered. That business was a thing of the past. The business of love was at hand, ever a sterner and crueler business than that of food-getting. And in the meanwhile the she-wolf, the cause of it all, sat down contentedly on her haunches and watched. She was ever pleased this was her day, and it came not often, when manes bristled and Fang smote Fang, or ripped and tore the yielding flesh, all for the possession of her. And in the business of love, the 3-year-old, who had made this his first adventure upon it, yielded up his life on either side of his body. Stood by his two rivals, they were gazing at the she-wolf, who sat smiling in the snow. But the elder leader was very wise in love, even as in battle. The younger leader turned his head to lick a wound on his shoulder. The curve of his neck was turned towards his rival. With his one eye, the elder saw the opportunity. He darted in low and closed with his fangs. It was a long, ripping slash, and deep as well. His teeth, in passing, burst the wall of the great vein of the throat. Then he leaped clear. The young leader snarled terribly, but his snarl broke midmost into a tickling cough. Bleeding and coughing, already stricken, he sprang at the elder and fought while life faded from him. His legs going weak beneath him, the light of day dulling on his eyes, his blows and springs falling shorter and shorter. And all the while the she-wolf sat on her haunches and smiled. She was made glad in vague ways by the battle, for this was the love-making of the wild, the sex tragedy of the natural world. That was tragedy only to those that died. To those that survived it was not tragedy, but realization and achievement. When the young leader lay in the snow, hello, Lixel. Uh, Thank you for the follow. Much appreciated. Hope you're doing well. Tragedy of the natural world that was tragedy only to those that died. To those that survived, it was not tragedy, but realization and achievement. When the young leader lay in the snow and moved no more, one eye stalked over to the she-wolf. His carriage was one of mingled triumph and caution. He was plainly expectant of a rebuff, and he was just as plainly surprised when her teeth did not flash out at him in anger. For the first time she met him with a kindly manner, she sniffed noses with him, and even condescended to leap about and frisk and play with. I'm doing well myself, thank you for asking. I hope your uh, low-key sick gets better. Him in quite puppyishness fashion, and he, for all his grey years and sage experience, behaved quite as puppishly, and even a little more foolishly. Forgotten already were the vanquished rivals and the love tale red written on the snow. Forgotten, save once when an old eye stopped for a moment to lick his stiffened wounds. Then it was that his lips, half writhed half-writhed into a snarl, and the hairs of his neck and shoulders involuntarily bristled, while he half crouched for a spring, his claws spasmodically clutching into the snow surface for firmer footing. But it was all forgotten. The next moment, as he sprang after the she-wolf, who was coyly leading him a chase through the woods. After that, they ran side by side, like good friends who have come to an understanding. The days passed by, and they kept together, hunting their meat and killing and eating it in common. After a while, the she-wolf began to grow restless. She seemed to be searching for something that she could not find. The hollows under fallen trees seemed to attract her, and her and she spent much time nosing about among the larger snow-piled crevices in the rocks and in the cave of overhanging banks. Old One Eye was not interested at all, but he followed her good-naturedly in her quest, and when her investigations in particular places were unusually protracted, he would lie down and wait until she was ready to go on. They did not remain in one place, but traveled across country until they regained the Mackenzie River, down which they slowly went, leaving it often to hunt game along the small streams that entered it, but always returning to it again. Sometimes they chanced upon other wolves, usually in. I appreciate the compliment, thank you, Lixel. Pairs, but there was no friendliness of intercourse displayed on either side, no gladness at meeting, no desire to return to the pack formation. Several times they encountered solitary wolves. These were always males, and they were pressingly insistent on joining with One Eye and his mate. This he resented, and when she stood shoulder to shoulder with him, bristling and showing her teeth, the aspiring solitary ones would back off, turn tail, and continue on their lonely way. One moment night running through the quiet forest, One Eye. Thank you for the compliment, Lixel. Suddenly halted. His muzzle went up, his tail stiffened, and his nostrils dilated as he scented the air. One foot also he held up after the manner of a dog. He was not satisfied, and he continued to smell the air, striving to understand the message borne upon it to him. One careless sniff had satisfied his mate, and she trotted on to assure him. Though he followed her, he was still dubious, and he could not forbear an occasional halt in order an occasional halt in order more carefully to study the warning. She crept out cautiously on the edge of a large open space in the midst of the trees, for well, thank you for the compliment. Uh, yeah, Sav, Lixel. Just call me Sav, okay? Or you could call me Mizo. Yeah, okay. Uh, Sometimes she stood alone, then one eye creeping and crawling, every sense on the alert, every hair radiating infinite suspicion joined her. They stood side by side, watching and listening, and smelling. To their ears came the sounds of dogs wrangling and scuffling, the guttural cries of men, the sharper voices of scolding women, and once the shrill and plaintive cry of a child. With the exception of the huge bulks of the skin lodges, little could be seen save the flames of the fire, broken by the movements of intervening bodies and the smoke rising slowly on the quiet air. But to their nostrils came the myriad smells of an Indian camp, carrying a story that was largely incomprehensible to one eye, but every detail of which the she wolf knew. It's all good. Yeah. She was strangely stirred and sniffed and sniffed with an increasing delight. But old One Eye was doubtful. He betrayed his apprehension and started tentatively to go. She turned and touched his neck with her muzzle in a reassuring way, then regarded the camp again. A new wistfulness was in her face, but it was not the wistfulness of hunger. She was thrilling to a desire that urged her to go forward, to be in closer to that fire, to be squabbling with the dogs, and to be avoiding and dodging the stumbling feet of men. One eye moved impatiently beside her. Her unrest came back upon her, and she knew again her pressing need to find the thing for which she searched. She turned and trotted back into the forest, to the great relief of One Eye, who trotted a little to the fore until they were well within the shelter of the trees. As they slid along noiseless as shadows in the moonlight, they came. I am currently reading White Fang. I had no idea about this book, aside from I know that it takes place around the winter time, and it has to do with wolves or huskies. And yeah, there are wolves and huskies. There's wolves and huskies in this. I think it has to do with the first story, at least first part one, had to do at least inside the winter. It was during the winter. Upon a runaway, both noses went down to the footprints in the snow. There you go. These footprints were very fresh. One Eye ran ahead cautiously, his mate at his heels. The broad pads of their feet were spread wide, and in contact with the snow were like velvet. One Eye caught sight of a dim movement of white in the midst of the white. His sliding gait had been deceptively swift, but it was as nothing to the speed at which he now ran. Before him was bounding the faint patch of white he had discovered. They were running along a narrow alley, flanked on either side by a growth of young spruce. Through the trees, the mouth of the alley could be seen. opening out on a moonlit glade. Old One Eye was rapidly overhauling this fleeing shape of white. Bound by bound he gained. Now he was upon it. One leap more and his teeth would be sinking into it. But that leap was never made. High in the air and straight up soared the shape of white, now a struggling snowshoe rabbit that leaped and bounded, executing a fantastic dance there above him, in the air, and never once returning to earth. One Eye sprang back with a snort of sudden fright, then shrank down to the snow and crouched. Snarling threats at this thing here he did not understand, but the she-wolf coolly thrust past him and she poised for a moment, then sprang for the dancing rabbit. She too soared high, but not so high at the quarry, and her teeth clipped epithecally together with a metallic snap. She made another leap and another. Her mate had slowly relaxed her from his crouch and was watching her. He now evinced displeasure at her repeated failures and himself made a. I got a copy. This is not Scooby Doo's collar. This is a replica that I got at Comic Con. Mighty sprang upward. His teeth closed upon the rabbit, and he bore it back to earth with him. But at the same time there was a suspicious crackling movement beside him, and his astonished eye saw a young spruce sapling bending down above him. To strike him, his jaws let go their grip, and he leaped backward to escape this strange danger, his lips drawn back from his fangs, his throat snarling, every hair bristling with rage and fright. And in that moment the sapling reared its slender length upright, and the rabbit soared dancing in the air again. Well, I enjoy Scooby Doo too, as well. Uh, that's why I decided to go ahead and get the replica. The she-wolf was angry. She sank her fangs into her mate's shoulder in reproof, and he, frightened, unaware of what constituted this new onslaught, struck back furiously and in still greater fright, ripping down the side of the she-wolf's muzzle. For him to resent such reproof was equally unexpected to her, and she sprang upon him in snarling. Indignation. Then he discovered his mistake and tried to placate her, but she proceeded to punish him roundly until he gave over all attempts at placation, and rolled in a circle, his head away from her. His shoulders, what is your question? Yeah. Receiving the punishment of her teeth. In the meantime, the rabbit danced above them. In the air, the she-wolf sat down in the snow, and Old One Eye, now more in fear of his mate than of the mysterious sapling, again sprang for the rabbit. As he sank back with it between his teeth, he kept his eye on the sapling. As before, it followed him back to earth. He crouched down under the impending blow, his hair bristling, but his teeth still keeping tight hold of the rabbit. But the blow did not fall. The sapling remained bent above him. When he moved, it moved, and he. Sure. Although I will let you know, I am taken, but friendship, a-okay with me. Growled at it through his clenched jaws. When he remained still, it remained still, and he concluded it was still to continue remaining still. Yet the warm blood of the rabbit tasted good in his mouth. It was his mate who relieved him from the quandary in which he found himself. She took the rabbit from him, and while the sapling swayed and teetered threateningly above her, she calmly gnawed off the rabbit's head. At once the sapling shot up, and after that gave no more trouble, remained in the decorous and perpendicular position in which oof, nature had intended it to grow. And between them the sea-wolf and One Eye devoured the game which the mysterious sapling had caught for them. There were other runways and valleys where rabbits were hanging in the air, and the wolf pair prospected them all, the she-wolf leading the way, old One Eye following and observant, learning the method of robbing snares, a knowledge destined to stand him in good stead in the days to come. And water break, so I can go ahead and keep my voice going. There we go. Chapter 2, The Lair. For 2 days the she-wolf and One Eye hung about the Indian camp. He was worried and apprehensive, yet the camp lured his mate, and she was loath to depart. But when one morning the air was rent with the report of a rifle close at hand, and a bullet smashed against a tree trunk several inches from One Eye's head, they hesitated no more, but went off on a long, swinging lope that put quick miles between them and the danger. They did not go far, a couple of days' journey. The she-wolf's need to find the thing for which she searched had now become imperative. She was getting very heavy and could run but slowly once in the pursuit of a rabbit, which she ordinarily would have caught with ease. She gave over and lay down and rested. One Eye came to her, but when he touched her neck gently with his muzzle, she snapped at him with such quick fierceness that he tumbled over backward, and cut a ridiculous figure in his effort to escape her teeth. Her temper was now shorter than ever, but he had become more patient than ever, and more solicitous. And when and then she found the thing for which I'll wait for the ad. Welcome back. So yeah, I usually just try to if I know that the ads are going on, then I'll wait for it. But like it essentially I had the option of either people can join, but they're going to watch through an ad before they get to see your content, or you're going to have sporadic advertisements while you're streaming every like 1 hour. So and then she found the thing for which she sought. It was a few miles up a small stream that in the summertime flowed into the Mackenzie, but that then was frozen over and frozen down to its rocky bottom. I usually try to be alive for 4, but Wednesdays are special because Wednesdays are just like extra. It's usually 4 for 4, so from what I remembered from when I was first starting stream, it was you should be uh, live for 4 hours for 4 days of the week. But Wednesday's my extra, just like let's do a let's do a short one. So that's usually when I play games from Humongous Entertainment, like Putt Putt, Pajama Sam, and Freddy Fish. But that then was frozen over and frozen down to its rocky bottom, a dead stream of solid white from source to mouth. The she-wolf was trotting wearily along, her mate well in advance, when she came upon the overhanging high clay bank. She turned aside and trotted over to it. The wear and tear of spring storms and melting snows had underwashed the bank, and in one place had made a small cave out of narrow fissures. I also usually stream at, instead of 2, I stream at 4 to have more of a variety, I guess. Anyway, she paused at the mouth of, EST. She paused at the mouth of the cave and looked the wall over carefully. Then on one side and the other she ran along the base of the wall to where its abrupt bulk merged from the softer lined landscape. Returning to the cave, she entered its narrow mouth. For a short 3 feet, she was compelled to crouch. Then the walls widened and rose higher in a little round chamber, nearly 6 feet in diameter. The roof barely cleared her head. It was dry and cozy. She inspected it with painstaking care, while one eye. Well, I usually don't read that. I'm not usually reading, so I usually play games and keep my mouth quiet. But I figured let's go ahead and I wasn't really sure what to do for this particular Christmas, so I decided let's go ahead and read a book. Like last year, I read The Christmas Carol. So this year, I decided to read White Fang, which I knew had to do with snow, huskies, and wolves. So luckily, it's just going to be a Wednesday thing for this month. Who had returned, stood in the entrance, and patiently watched her. She dropped her head with her nose to the ground and directed toward a point near to her closely bunched feet, and around this point she circled several times. Then, with a tired sigh that was almost a grunt, she curled her body in, relaxed her legs, and dropped down her head toward the entrance. One eye, with pointed, interested ears, laughed at her, and beyond, outlined against the white light, she could see the brush of his tail, waving good-naturedly her own ears. With a snuggling movement, laid the sharp points backward and down against the head for a moment. while her mouth opened and her tongue lolled uh, peaceably out, and in this way she expressed that she was pleased and satisfied. One eye was hungry, though he lay down in the entrance and slept. His sleep was fitful. He kept awaking, and cocking his ears at the bright world without, where the April sun was blazing across the snow. When he dozed upon his ears, would steal the faint whispers of hidden trickles of running water, and he would rouse and listen intently. The sun had come back, and all the awakening Northland world appreciation appreciate the cookie. Thank you. Come back, and all the awakening Northland world was calling to him. Life was stirring, the feel of spring was in the air, and feel of growing life under the snow, of sap, ascending in the trees of buds bursting the shackles of the frost. He cast anxious glances at his mate, but she showed no desire to get up. He looked outside, and half a dozen snowbirds fluttered across his field of vision. He started to get up, then looked back to his mate again, and settled down and dozed. A shrill and minute singing stole upon his hearing once and twice. He sleepily. If you have extra, I want. I'll have some. Sure. Just not green tea. I don't. I prefer not to have caffeine. Brushed his nose with his paw. Then he woke up. There, buzzing in the air at the tip of his nose, was a lone mosquito. It was a full-grown mosquito, one that had lain frozen in a dry log all winter, and that had now been thawed out by the sun. He could resist the cool of the world no longer. Beside, he was hungry. He crawled over to his mate and tried to persuade her to get up, but she only snarled at him, and he walked out alone into the bright sunshine to find the snow surface soft underfoot, and the traveling difficult. He went up to the he went up the frozen bed of the stream, where the snow shaded by the trees was yet hard and crystalline. He was gone 8 hours, and he came back through the darkness, hungrier than when he had started. He had found game, but he had not caught it. He was broken through the melting snow crust and wallowed while the snowshoe rabbits had skimmed along on top, lightly as ever. He paused at the mouth of the cave with a sudden shock of suspicion. Faint, strange sounds came from within. They were sounds not made by his mate, and yet they were. Uh, Due to it being closer to Christmas, I choose the Jack Skellington Nightmare Before Christmas. Um, as for Honey and Sugar, I'll let you choose. Remotely familiar. He bellied cautiously inside and was met by a warning snarl from the she-wolf. This he received without perturbation, though he obeyed it by keeping his distance, but he remained interested in the other sounds, faint, muffled sobbings and slobberings. His mate warned him irritably away, and he curled up and slept in the entrance. When morning came and a dim light pervaded the air, he again sought after the source of the remotely familiar sounds. There was a new note in his mate's warning snarl. It was a jealous note, and he was very One moment, I am going to go ahead and check on something. Appreciate the honey and the tea and the mug. Yeah, I'll go ahead and drink some water to make it sound more like I'm drinking from uh, said concoction. There we go. Let me really quick make sure. Okay. Carefully and keeping distance, a respectful distance, nevertheless, he made out sheltering between her legs against the length of her body 5 strange little bundles of life, very feeble, very helpless, making tiny whimpering noises with eyes that did not open to the light. He was surprised it was not the first time in his long and successful life that this thing had happened. It had happened many times, yet each time it was as fresh a surprise as ever to him. His mate looked at him anxiously. Every little while she emitted a low growl, and at times, when it seemed to her he approached too near, the growl shot up in her throat to a sharp snarl. Of her own experience, she had no memory of the thing happening, but in an instinct which was the experience of all the mothers of wolves, there lurking a memory of fathers that had eaten their newborn and hopeless progeny, it manifested itself as a fear strong within her that made her prevent one eye from more closely inspecting the cubs he had fathered. But there was no danger. Old One Eye was feeling the urge of an impulse that was, in turn, an instinct that had come down to him from all the fathers of wolves. He did not question it, nor puzzle over it. It was there in the fibre of his being, and it was the most natural thing in the world that he should obey it by turning his back on his newborn family, and by trotting out in a way on the meat trail whereby he lived. 5 or 6 miles from the lair, the stream divided its forks, going off among the mountains at a right angle. Here, leading up the left fork, he came upon a fresh track. He smelled it and found it so recent that he crouched swiftly and looked in the direction in which it disappeared. Then he turned deliberately and took the right fork. The footprint was much larger than the one his own feet made, and he knew that in the wake of such a trail there was little meat for him. Half a mile up the right fork, his quick ears caught the sound of gnawing teeth. He stalked the quarry, and found it to be a porcupine standing upright against a tree and trying his teeth on the bark. One eye approached carefully but hopelessly. He knew the breed, though he had never met it so far north before, and never in his long life had porcupine served him for a meal. But he had long since learned that there was such a thing as chance or opportunity, and he continued to draw near. There was never any of telling what might happen, for with live things, events were somehow always happening differently. All right. Good luck with the uh, blankets and stuff. The porcupine rolled itself into a ball, irritating long, sharp needles in all directions that defied attack. In his youth, one eye had once sniffed too near a similar, apparently inert ball of quills, and had the tail flick out suddenly in his face. One quill he had carried away in his muzzle, where it had remained for weeks, a ranking flame until it finally worked out. So he lay down in a comfortable crouching position, his nose fully a foot away and out of the line of the tail. Thus he waited, keeping perfectly quiet. There was no telling something might happen. The porcupine might unroll. There might be opportunity for a deft and ripping thrust of paw into the tender, unguarded belly. But at the end of half an hour he rose, growled wrathfully at the motionless ball, and trotted on. He had waited too long and futilely in the past for porcupines to unroll, to waste any more time. He continued up the right fork. The day wore along, and nothing rewarded his hunt. The urge of his the urge of his awakened instincts of fatherhood was strong upon him. He must find meat. In the afternoon he blundered upon a pteranodon. He came out of a thicket and found himself face to face with a slow-witted bird. Was sitting on a log not a foot beyond the end of his nose. Each saw the other. The bird made a startled rise, but he struck it with his paw and smashed it down onto earth. Then pounced upon it and caught it in his teeth. As it scuttled along the snow, trying to rise in the air again, as his teeth crunched through the tended flesh and fragile bones, he began naturally to eat. Then he remembered, and turning on the back track, started for home, carrying the pteranodon in his mouth. A mile above the forks, running velvet-footed as was his custom, a gliding shadow that cautiously prospected each new vista of the trail. He came upon later imprints of the large tracks he discovered in the early morning. As the track led his way, he followed, prepared to meet the maker of it at every turn of the stream. He slid his head around a corner. I do have a Discord channel. I need to know you a little bit better. No offense, to be friends, but on there. But you can join the group channel. He slid his head around a corner of rock, where began an unusually large bend in the street, and his quick eyes made out something that sent him crouching swiftly down. It was the maker of the track, a large female lynx. She was crouching as he had crouched only once that day. In front of her, the tight rolled ball of quills. If he had been a gliding shadow before, he now became the ghost of such a shadow, and he crept and circled around, and came up well to leeward of the silent, motionless pair. He lay down in the snow, depositing the ptarmigan beside him, and with eyes peering through the needles of a low groaning spruce, he watched the play of life before him. The waiting lynx and the waiting porcupine, each intent on life, and such was the curiousness of the game. The way of life for one lay in the eating of the. Well, I appreciate you joining the stream. You know, uh, other, and the way of life for the other lay in being not eaten. While Old One Eye, the wolf crouching in the covert, played his part too in the game, waiting for some strange freak of chance that might help him on the meat trail which was his way of life. Half an hour passed, an hour, and nothing happened. The ball of quills might have been a stone for all it moved. The lynx might have been frozen to marble, and Old One Eye might have been dead. Yet all three animals were keyed to a tenseness of living that was almost painful, and scarcely ever would it come to them to be more alive than they were than in their seeming petrification. One eye moved slightly and peered forth with increased eagerness. Something that was happening. The porcupine had at last decided that its enemy had gone away. Slowly, cautiously, it was unrolling its ball of impregnable armor. It was agitated by no tremor of anticipation. Slowly, slowly, the bristling ball straightened out and lengthened. One eye watching felt a sudden moistness in his mouth and a drooling of saliva. Involuntarily excited by the living meat that was spreading itself like a repast before him. Not quite entirely had the porcupine unrolled when it discovered its enemy. In that instant the lynx struck. The blow was like a flash of light, the paw with rigid claws curving like talons, shot under the tender belly, and came back with a swift, ripping movement. Had the porcupine been entirely unrolled, or had it not discovered its enemy a fraction of a second before the blow struck, the paw would have escaped unscathed. But a side flick of the tail sank sharp wheels into it as it was withdrawn. Everything had happened at once. The blow, the counterblow, the squeal of agony from the porcupine, the big cat's squall of sudden hurt and astonishment. One eye half arose in his excitement, his ears up, his tail straight out, and quivering behind him, the lynx bad temper got the best of her. She sprang savagely at the thing, but had hurt her. That had hurt her. But the porcupine, squealing and grunting with disrupted anatomy, trying feebly to roll up into its protection, flickered out its tail again and again. The big cat squalled with hurt and astonishment. Then she fell to backing away and sneezing, her nose bristling with quills like a monstrous pin cushion. She brushed her nose with her paw, trying to dislodge the fiery darts, thrust it into the snow, and rubbed it against twigs and branches, and all the time leaping about, ahead, sideways, up and down, in a frenzy of pain and fright. She sneezed continuously, and her stub of a tail was doing its best towards lashing about, but giving quick, violent jerks. She quit her antics and quieted down for a long minute. One Eye watched, and even he could not repress a start and an involuntary bristling of hair along his back, when she suddenly leaped without warning straight up in the air, at the same time emitting a long and most terrible squall. Then she sprang away, up the trail, squalling with every leap she made. It was not until her racket had faded away in the distance and died out that One Eye ventured forth. He walked as delicately as though all the snow were carpeted with porcupine quills, erect and ready to pierce the soft pads of his feet. Porcupine met his approach with a furious squealing and a clashing of its long teeth. It had managed to roll up in a ball again, but it was not quite the old compact ball. Its muscles were too much torn for that. It had been ripped almost in half and was still bleeding profusely. One Eye scooped out mouthfuls of the blood-soaked snow, and chewed, and tasted, and swallowed. This served as a relish, and his hunger increased mightily. But he was too old in the world to forget his caution. He waited, he lay down, and waited while the porcupine grated its teeth, and uttered grunts and sobs and occasional sharp little squeals. In a little while, One Eye noticed that the quills were drooping, and that a great quivering had set up. The quivering came to an end suddenly. There was a final defiant flash of the long teeth. Then all the quills drooped quite down, and the body relaxed and moved no more. With a nervous, shrinking paw, One Eye stretched out the porcupine to its full length and turned it over on its back. Nothing had happened. It was surely dead. He studied it intently for a moment, then took a careful grip with his teeth, and started off down the street, partly carrying, partly dragging the porcupine with his head, turned to the side so as to avoid stepping on the prickly mass. He recollected. Something dropped the burden, and trotted back to where he had left the patera midget. He did not hesitate a moment. He knew clearly what was to be done, and this he did by promptly eating the patera midget. Then he returned and took up his burden. When he dragged the result of his day's hunt into the cave, the she-wolf inspected it, turned her muzzle to him, and lightly licked him on the neck. But the next instant she was warning him away from the cubs with a snarl that was less harsh than usual, and that was more apologetic than menacing. Her instinctive fear of the father of her progeny was toning down. He was behaving as a wolf father should, and manifesting no unholy desire to devour the young lives he had brought into the world. Sure, I accept fan art. Chapter 3 The Great Cub. He was different from his brothers and sisters. Their hair already betrayed the reddish hue inherited from their mother, the she-wolf, while he alone in this particular took after his father. He was the one little grey cub of the litter. He had bred true to the straight wolf stock. In fact, he had bred true to old One Eye himself, physically, but with but a single exception, and that was he had two eyes to his father's one. The grey cub's eyes had not been open long, yet already he could see with steady clearness, and while his eyes were still closed, he had felt, tasted, and smelled. He knew his two brothers and his two sisters very well. He had begun to romp with them in a feeble, awkward way, and even to squabble, his little throat vibrating with queer, rasping noise. The forerunner of the growl. As he worked himself into a passion, and long before his eyes had opened, he had learned by touch, taste, and smell to know his mother a fount of warmth and liquid food and tenderness. She posed a gentle, careless tongue that soothed him when it passed over his soft little body, and that impelled him to snuggle close against her and to doze off to sleep. Most of the first month of his life had been passed thus in sleeping, but now he could see quite well, and he stayed awake for longer periods of time. Let me help anybody who is interested in doing a bit of a fan art of me. There we go. And he was coming to learn his world quite well. His world was gloomy, but he did not know that, for he knew no other world. It was dim lighted, but his eyes had never had to adjust themselves to any other light. His world was very small, its limits were the walls of the lair. But as he had no knowledge of the whole wide world outside, he had never oppressed by the narrow confines of his existence, but he had early discovered that one wall of his world was different from the rest. This was the mouth of the cave and the source of life. He discovered that it was different from the other walls long before he had any thoughts of his own, any conscious volitions. It had been a irresistible attraction before ever his eyes opened and looked open upon it. The light from it had beat upon his sealed lids, and the eyes and the optic nerves had pulsated two little sparks like flashes. Warm colors and strangely pleasing the life of his body, of every fiber of his body, the life that was the very substance of his body, and that was apart from his own personal life, had ward yearned toward his light, and urged his body toward it in the same way that the cunning chemistry of a plant urges it towards the sun. Always in the beginning, before his conscious life dawned, he had crawled towards the mouth of the cave, and in this his brothers and sisters were one with him. Never in that period did any of them crawl towards the dark corners of the back wall. The light drew them as if they were plants. The chemistry of the life that composed them demanded the light as a necessity of beings, and their little puppet bodies crawled blindly and chemically like the tendrils of a vine. Later on, when each developed individually and became personally conscious of impulsions and desires, the attraction of the light increased. They were always crawling and sprawling toward it, and being driven back from it by their mother. It was in this way that the gray cub, learned other attributes of his mother than the soft, soothing tongue, and his insistent falling towards the light. He discovered in him and knows that with a sharp nudge administered rebuke, and later a paw that crushed him down and rolled him over and over with swift, calculating stroke. Thus he learned hurt, and on the top of it he learned to avoid, first by not incurring the risk of it, and second when he had incurred the risk by dodging and by retreating. These were conscious actions, and were the result of his first generalizations upon the world. Before that he had recoiled automatically from hurt, as he had crawled automatically towards the light. After he recoiled from hurt before because he knew that it was hurt, he was a fierce little cub. So were his brothers and sisters. It was to be expected. He was a carnivorous animal. He came of a breed of meat killers and meat eaters. His father and mother lived wholly upon meat. The milk he had sucked with his first flickering life was milk transformed directly from meat, and now, at a month old, when his eyes had been open for about a week, he was beginning himself to eat meat half digested by the she-wolf and disgorged for the 5 growling cubs that already made too great demand upon her breast. But he was further the fiercest of the litter. He could make a louder, rasping growl than any of them. His tiny rages were much more terrible than theirs. It was he that first learned the trick of rolling a fellow cub over with a cunning paw stroke, and it was he that first gripped another cub by the ear and pulled and tugged and growled through jaws tight clenched, and certainly it was he that caused the mother the most trouble in keeping her litter from the mouth of the cave. The fascination of the light for the grey cub increased from day to day. He was perpetually departing on yard-long adventures towards the cave's entrance, and was perpetually being driven back. Only he did not know it was it for an entrance. He did not know anything about entrances. Passages whereby one goes from one place to another place. He did not know any other place, much less of a way to get there. So to him, the entrance of the cave was a wall of light, as the sun was to the outside dweller. The wall was to him the sun of his world. It attracted him as a candle attracts a moth. He was always striving to attain it. The life was so swiftly expanding within him, urged him continually toward the wall of light. The life that was within him knew that it was the one way out, the way he was predestined to tread. But he himself did not know anything about it. He did not know there was any outside at all. There was one strange thing about his wall of light. His father, he had already come to recognize his father as the one other dweller in the world, a creature like his mother who slept near the light and was the bringer of meat. His father had a way of walking right into the white far wall and disappearing. The grey cub could not understand this. Though never permitted by his mother to approach that wall, he had approached the other walls and encountered hard obstruction on the wall of his tender nose. This hurt, and after several such adventures he left the walls alone. Without thinking about it, he accepted this disappearing into the wall as a particularity of his father, as milk and half-digested meat were particularities of his mother. In fact, the grey cub was not given to thinking, at least to the kind of thinking customary of men. His brain worked in dim ways, yet his conclusions were as sharp and distinct as those achieved by men. He had a method of accepting things without questioning the why and wherefore. In reality, this was the act of classification. He was never disturbed over why a thing happened. How it happened was sufficient for him. Thus, when he had bumped into his nose on the back wall a few times, he accepted that he would not disappear into walls. In the same way, he accepted that his father could disappear into walls. But he was not in the least disturbed by desire to find out the reason for the difference between his father and himself. Logic and physics were no part of his mental makeup. Like most creatures of the wild, he early experienced famine. There came a time when not only did the meat supply cease, but the milk no longer came from his mother's breast. At first, the cubs whimpered and cried, but for the most part, they slept. It was not long before they were reduced to a coma of hunger. There were no more spats and squabbles, no more tiny rages, nor attempts to growling, while the adventures toward the far white wall ceased together. The cubs slept while the life that was in them flickered and died down. One eye was desperate. He ranged far and wide, had slept but little in the lair that had now become cheerless and miserable. The she-wolf, too, left her litter and went out in search of meat. In the first days after the birth of the cubs, One Eye had journeyed several times back to the Indian camp and robbed the rabbits' nest. But with the melting of the snow and the opening of the streams, the Indian camp had moved away, and that source of supply was close to him. When the gray cub came back to life and again took interest in the far white wall, he found the population of his world had been reduced. Only one sister remained to him. The rest were gone. As he grew stronger, he found himself compelled to play alone, for the sister no longer lifted her head nor moved about. His little body rounded out with the meat he now ate, but the food he came too late for her. She slept continuously, a tiny skeleton flung round with skin in which the flame flickered lower and lower, and at last went out. Then there came a time when the grey cub no longer saw his father appearing and disappearing in the wall, nor lying down asleep in the entrance. This had happened at the end of a second and less severe famine. The she-wolf knew why One Eye never came back, but there was no way by which she could tell what she had seen to the grey cub, hunting herself for meat up the left fork of the stream where lived the lynx. She had followed a day-old trail of One Eye, and she had found him, or what remained of him, at the end of the trail. There were many signs of the battle that had been fought, and of the lynx's withdrawal to her there after having won the victory. Before she went away, the she-wolf had found this lair, but the signs told her that the lynx was inside, and she had not dared to venture in. After that, the she-wolf in her hunting avoided the left fork, for she knew that in the lynx's lair was a litter of kittens, and she knew the lynx for a fierce, bad-tempered creature and a terrible fighter. It was all very well for half a dozen wolves to drive a lynx spitting and bristling up a tree, but it was quite a different matter for a lone wolf to encounter a lynx, especially when the lynx was known to have a litter of hungry kittens at her back. But the wild is the wild, and the motherhood is motherhood, and all times fiercely protective, whether in the wild or out of it. And the time was to come when the she-wolf, for her grey cub's sake, would venture the left fork, and the lair in the rocks, and the lynx's wrath. All right. Use bookmark. Use the blue one. Thank you all for watching. Have a great night. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. It might be a little late. I'm not sure. But I'll be streaming tomorrow. Plan is Kingdom Hearts 3. And I'll go ahead and let you all know that if you're interested in my Discord server or anything, feel free to join. Just try to be try to be on good behavior. There are rules set, so keep those in mind. And let's go ahead and see who else is streaming, so we can set off for a good raid. All right, let's go ahead and read off to Waffles, who is currently playing Paradigm. Please give love and support to Waffles. And I'll see you all tomorrow. Freaking North 3. Again, might be a little late. Heads up. Later.